Hey everyone, Simon here. Dev and I will be back very soon. We are taking the month of February a little more slowly, but have some very cool stuff planned as we head into March. Soon enough, we'll be crossing into the hardcourt swings and the sunshine double. You always know that spring is just around the corner when you see Indian Wells circled on the calendar. As a little walk down memory lane, I wanted to go back to an interview I did with Andrew Reiley of Cult Tennis. I'm sure if you're listening to this show, you are familiar with his work. He's produced a bunch of very cool episodes on YouTube, which deal with some of the more eclectic moments in tennis history. I chatted in this episode to him about Donald Young, maybe one of the most famous examples of what-ifs in the sport of tennis. So much hype, so much expected from him, and as you'll hear, it didn't all quite pan out that way. Enjoy the show, and we'll both talk to you very soon. Pleased to welcome to the Open Era podcast, Andrew Reiley of Cult Tennis. Andrew, thank you very much for being on the show.
Simon, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Really glad to be here and talk about, honestly, one of my favorite players on tour.
He's a fascinating one. Donald Young. Where to start with someone like that? Let's just do off the top. You personally, Andrew, you've recently started making mini documentaries, I'm going to call them, on Cult Tennis on YouTube. I'm a huge fan of them, I have to say. I've learned a lot specifically about blue clay. I've been banging the drum for a while that I want to make the US Open a blue clay surface. I don't know how much reception I'm going to get to that, but why did you start making these videos, and what particular about Donald Young did you think would make a really good piece of content?
Sure, yeah. So basically, watching YouTube for a while, some of my favorite content to watch, mainly when I'm kind of relaxing, is a lot of these video essays, these mini documentaries where a host will talk about a topic for 10, 15 minutes in depth and really educational stuff. And, as a tennis player myself, as someone who teaches tennis as a living, tennis has just been in my background all my life. And there's not a ton of good tennis content on YouTube unless you're purely looking for highlights and whatnot, full match content. And there's no real analysis unless you're just talking about, a host talking about, in podcast form. This is a fantastic podcast, but I don't think we see too much audio visual, I suppose, on YouTube. So it came to a point earlier this year, I was just like, well, if no one else is going to do it, I guess I'll start. And with no really video editing background whatsoever, I kind of just took to the ground running. And Donald was actually my first subject to tackle, just because he's really been one of my favorites over the years. He's a very interesting character with a great backstory and maybe a little bit of a cautionary tale for future players to follow. Absolutely.
You recently released a video on Guillermo Correa, who is an incredibly fascinating character as well. I feel incredibly bad for him, just given the way that his career sort of unfolded at the back end of after that French Open final. Really a cautionary tale in his own right of a player that should have won a Grand Slam, should have won multiple Grand Slams. Do you have a sort of a list of subjects that you'd like to tackle, or is there stuff in particular in the sport of tennis which sort of piques your interest?
It's interesting. A lot of times I get comments or PMs about people wanting me to cover their topics. And as much as I'd love to cover everything, these videos take about 30, 40 hours each. And in the end, a lot of it just kind of boils down to what I think content that people will watch, in addition to stories I followed over the years, things that I personally find really interesting. Maybe I'm being selfish, but some of these stories are just too good not to share, such as the Guillermo Correa video I just put out. Absolutely ridiculous bonkers of a match and really interesting backstory. So as long as there's a really cool backstory, some pinnacle climax, so to speak, and as long as I can put some cool music to it, I think it's A-okay for me.
No, it makes complete sense. It's interesting you mentioned the lack of sort of, I would say, in-depth and technical analysis of the sport on YouTube or in general. I think that's probably a point that we can touch on at the back end of this after we talk about Donald Young, because I would say in general that the tennis media hasn't done a particularly good job of evolving with the time. So I think it's very interesting that you take this on as a project, because I'm with you. I think more in-depth, long-form analysis on YouTube specifically would be a really good thing for the sport.
Yeah, well, like I said, I appreciate your praise to my mediocre video skills at this point. But yeah, no, hopefully hopefully we may start a trend, you and me, and your podcast, very similar, kind of follows the style that I use as well, and vice versa. And I'd really love to see, other sports have it. I'd love to see tennis get a little bit more in the spotlight in terms of that. So absolutely looking forward to making some better content in the future.
All right, let's do it then. Let's touch on Donald Young. In the past few weeks on this podcast, we've touched on Jennifer Capriati and Coco Gauff, two teenage phenomenons, US teenage phenomenons in their own right. Donald Young, in so many ways, was the male equivalent of those two players in the very early stages of his career. It's difficult at this point to really summarize sort of 10, 15 years removed from his junior career, quite how good he was as a junior. What do you think drove a lot of the early noise about him in regards to American tennis?
Right. So when you see American tennis throughout the years, 80s into the 90s, we had players like Jimmy Connors, John McEnroe. 90s into the 2000s, we had Pete Sampras, Andre Agassi, and then Andy Roddick capping it all by winning the 2003 U.S. Open. It almost seemed like there was a bit of a drop-off in terms of talent coming through the reins, so to speak. And I think America was almost too accustomed to having someone on top. So when Donald Young was making his rounds, really tearing it up on the junior circuit, I believe he was just someone to latch onto. He had a really interesting backstory. He was a Black American, so he kind of had everything going for him. He was really looking to be the next one, and then unfortunately, as we'll talk about it, he didn't really just seem to make the cusps as many people would have hoped.
In your documentary, you look at the Trans World Sport piece. They're usually not wrong, I have to say. I'm a big proponent of theirs. I've watched them ever since I was a young kid. They've been around for a long time. And when they do these mini documentaries and these mini shorts on players who are coming up, you realize that they're mostly right. You see the Maria Sharapova one. I saw they very recently did one on Carlos Alcaraz as well. So they clearly have high expectations for a kid like Alcaraz as well. Donald Young, so it's impossible to not talk about his family and not talk about his parents specifically. What sort of role did his family take on, and in particular his father, in terms of coaching him as a young player?
Right. A lot of times in tennis, it almost seems like the parents begin to coach the kids from a young age. A lot of these professional tennis players in the future initially had tennis player parents themselves. And then they almost transition out of that. They get to professional coaching staffs from the country's federation, and they go from there. In Donald's case, it was a bit differently. He had the natural aptitude for tennis from a young age. His parents noticed that, and they began training him. But in the case of his parents, his mother and father, Ilona and Donald Sr., it almost seemed like they had the right thing going, and they almost kept on as they did. They kept coaching Donald throughout his childhood. And it's a very interesting dynamic in that sense, as the more he won, the more his parents kind of latched onto him. And although the USTA did give him money to travel, and eventually he did get sponsorships, endorsements, and maybe he had more opportunities for a better coaching staff, I guess he seemed to use what worked well for him. And that's followed him now into adulthood, as you'll see. Especially his mom follows him around to tournaments, and he mainly is a family man, stays around with his family. So it's an interesting dynamic. So it's hard to say whether that's worked in the long term for him, but definitely something to consider as we go forward talking about this.
I wonder whether or not there is actually a strong comparison with Jennifer Capriati here as well, just given how involved Stefano Capriati was in Jennifer's early career. Just, I think, a little different in a sense that Jennifer was so good so early and made that transition to being a top 10 player at the age of 14, which is absolutely ridiculous when you consider the modern day sporting world. The fact that someone can be in the latter stages of Grand Slams at 14 and 15 years of age, it's astonishing. But you do sort of wonder, does Donald Young Jr., did he come from a poorer background? Is this a sense that the parents saw their child as a sort of saw the money signs going, or is this simply a case that they really wanted to elevate him and got a little overly involved? So was this financially driven, do you think, or was this really just a sense of being over-parenting in a sense?
So I can't say for sure. After researching, the player quite a bit, At first, it doesn't seem like that, but as he goes on through his career, Donald turned professional at a very young age in comparison to others who might turn professional around 18, 19. He turned professional at 14 years old, and it was actually mainly to cover his travel costs, his living costs. He was born on the south side of Chicago. He moved to the South, Georgia, eventually, but I don't believe he was born into a very wealthy family whatsoever, and I think his tennis abilities really gave an incentive to turn professional early to help his family get through some maybe difficult times early enough. So I think money played a role in maybe how early he got started and maybe why he went through some of these growing pains, whereas other kids matured, maybe went to university and played Division I tennis and maybe had a few more years to work with. Donald, I think, was almost pressured to start early, and I think that maybe caused some of the early issues and doubters when people really didn't see him winning a match. I mean, after all, this kid was only 14, 15 years old playing these large-scale tournaments, and as we'll see later, he ended up having to go back to juniors more often than not and play in the smaller scale tournaments against younger kids because he just couldn't make it with the older kids at his age.
It's quite an astonishing story when you consider that he was so good as a junior, he made that transition to being a pro and then really immensely struggled at the early parts of his career before returning to the junior circuits and having a really strong amount of success. I think it's impossible to say at this point, but if it feels like the decision to turn pro did negatively affect his career in general. It's easy to sit here playing armchair critic on it, but when we look at his junior results prior to that, there is a player there that clearly was capable of going pro. Why? I know you mentioned some of the factors of why he would have turned pro, but do you think he was ready for it at that point?
I really don't think so. There's such a large gap from the junior level to the professional level. There's a reason why, top Division I players really struggle in the beginning. You take a look at maybe Steve Johnson, who's now a great player himself, but early on really struggled in his career after winning multiple NCAA singles titles. And that was someone almost 21, 22 years old when he joined the professional tour. Now you jump back to this 14-year-old kid. Not everyone can be Rafael Nadal, really, who jumps right off from the gate and starts winning Grand Slams. Donald was a smaller kid whose strokes didn't necessarily rely on power or, he didn't push his opponents around. He was more of a grinder, a counterpuncher. That being said, he worked well against the pace and speed of kids his age. It really did not translate well. His game did not translate well as it was to an older generation, and he really struggled in those early years. Absolutely. He was almost caught in a catch-22 where he was too good for his own age, but he was really not ready for the spotlight that I think in his mind he thought he was ready for. So that's when the press started noticing these weird losses he was having over time, and it really started to cause some issues for him, not just on the court but mentally as well, I imagine.
Can you just take a few seconds to walk us through his junior results? Because it's pretty staggering, and we tend to forget just how good of a junior he was just at the latter stages of how far he made it in tournaments.
Right. So if we're talking about Easter Bowl and Kalamazoo and the Junior Grand Slams, I mean, he wasn't just good. He was absolutely dominant, win after win after win after win. And I'm not talking about just when he was 16, 17 years old. He reached the number one ranking of the junior circuit at 14 years old, which is absolutely unheard of. He was such a young kid, beating kids almost, 3-4 years his elder. And again, we take a look at his terrible results early on, but you have to realize at the same time he was winning the Junior Australian Open at 15 years of age. It's almost incredible at the time. He was beating fellow Americans who we know of now, Ryan Harrison, Michael Venus, all of these great players who became, really good in the next 4 or 5 years. He was beating them handily, whereas a few years later it wouldn't necessarily be the case. So again, that catch-22 aspect.
So you touched upon something that I think is the most fascinating part of his story, and really what separates incredibly high-ranked juniors making that transition into the senior game. I think when I look at him, his speed is obviously an asset, and his just consistency is an asset as well. But he doesn't have any weapons. And I think that's probably the biggest factor that I would say. I mean that as no disrespect at all, because he's a professional tennis player who made it to the top 50 in the world. So he clearly has weapons and is clearly a person who is ungodly talented at this sport. But in terms of separating himself and within the top 50, I think this is one of the big things that we tend to overlook in terms of that transition from the junior side of things, which is what is the big thing that is going to make damage in the top 50, in the top 20? What is the thing that you're going to rely on? And it seems like that was one of the hardest things for him, is trying to figure out how to make that step from being a junior into a senior player. And what really was he going to hang his hat on? What was the thing above everything else that when he was in a clutch moment, what was going to be his defining weapon? And it seemed like he never really figured that out.
No, I agree. Touching back on someone, a few years later who pulled a similar move, Nadal, who played in Grand Slams when he was only 16 years old. That player himself, they both had the speed, they both had the loopy counterpunching strokes, but you'll see as the progression of someone like Rafael Nadal, his strength improved immensely over the years. His ability to put away balls, he improved his serve over time. Donald Young, although he did get stronger as he kind of grew up, it wasn't a dramatic change that maybe many were expecting. He still had the same loopy counterpunching strokes. He still was fast, but nothing to put any top player away. He's never given Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, he's never given those players even a slight issue. I don't believe he's even ever taken a set from either of those players. And even as he jumped into the top 50, it just wasn't, he played well. And especially when he was winning, he was, just not missing. But he never had that spark that could have really propelled him. Even when he was getting to that high level, I personally didn't believe he would reach any higher. And my suspicions were confirmed when he kind of, he's a good 50 to 100 player over time, but he never, from that young age to adulthood, he just never developed that weapon that he really needed. And I think that's really hindered his career all this time.
So let's look at that transition from him being a junior into a senior. It was a struggle for a while, but also the rise was interesting to look at. You mentioned that he was a very consistent player. It makes sense that he would find a home within the top 100. And that list of players who have been the youngest, who are the youngest inside of the top 100 goes Nadal, Gasquet, Hewitt, Del Potro, Federer, Djokovic, Young. I mean, it's not a bad list of players to be associated with, really, is it?
No, not at all. And it's a great list to put together because these are players who have stood the test of time, players who have stayed on the tour for 5, 10, 15 plus years. And despite injuries and whatnot, we remember these players. But Simon, you take a look at these players and you read the name and that defining aspect of their game, right? Gasquet has that beautiful one-hand backhand, which puts everyone away. Hewitt is just unstoppable in terms of his movement, can run down any ball. Del Potro has that wild forehand. And then you see Donald Young, and to the common tennis fan, I don't really think anyone could really put that aspect of what makes him good. He's good, but what's that spark, and has he found it? I'm not entirely sure.
So I think he did. He made a run at some tournaments. He won a couple of challengers events, and during the early part of his career, he sort of hovered between that 75 and 200 range in the world rankings. Which honestly, there's a saying in English football which I came up through, which is effectively he found his level, and it's meant as a sort of disrespectful way of phrasing things, which is it's sort of said in a derogatory manner to people who are like playing a little above their level and are sort of meant to encourage them to find a level a bit more suited to where they are. But I think it kind of holds true for Donald Young in a lot of ways, which he sort of. And we'll come on to 2011 in a lot of ways, because I think it really is the pinnacle of his career in so many ways. But that 75 to 200 range, so maybe if you're generous, giving a good run would be a top 50 player. It seems about where he netted out for his career in general.
Absolutely. And, when you take a look at by the time he turned professional to about 2011, when we're going to talk about maybe his breakout year, he wasn't necessarily playing good on the tour, but looking at his minor league challenger results, he was crushing it, against players ranked 3, 4, 500 in the world. He was, again, almost unstoppable. He was winning challenger after challenger, wasn't even in the futures level anymore. And maybe America thought that, maybe he just needed a few years to grind it out like every other player would to kind of make it. And I think that little run he had of challenger wins really gave him the confidence going forward that maybe he was a real contender. I don't think in his mind he thought he was limited by any sort of ranking range. Time would tell, of course, but I think those wins really showed him that he belonged on this tour. At what level, though? So now we kind of take a look at 2011 when he really makes a mark on the world.
2011 was an incredible year for Donald Young. It was the peak of his career. There are bad things to come, though, including a 17-match losing streak. We'll touch on that more with Andrew Reiley, our guest, after the break. 2011 starts in odd fashion. He's had a few run-ins with the USTA over the years in terms of some of the comments he's made, and there was a very, very odd situation that he ended up getting involved with Ryan Harrison, which we'll come into in a little bit, back into 2018, 2019, around then. But 2011 starts with him going on Twitter and effectively blasting the USTA over a wildcard policy. I believe he also had a run-in with Patrick McEnroe over selections in the Davis Cup as well. I think Ryan Harrison was at the center of that one as well, which seems to be a bit of animosity between the two. I don't know where that comes from or whether I'm just making it up. In terms of his this sort of little uproar, this little sort of mini tantrum that was directed towards the USTA. Do you know where this came from and what sort of was the background to it? Was this just a kid who felt like he was being treated poorly by the association, or was this just an example of frustration at his own game at that point?
Right. So you have to remember when Donald first joined the tour as a really young teenager, in effect, he was granted a lot of wild cards, probably more than he should have been at his age, at his ranking, at his skill level. I think he was more granted wild cards on his potential as opposed to his skill. And going forward here, he's now in 2011 where he's almost a normal kid on the tour who's almost spoiled by the amount of exposure he's gotten over the years. And it almost seems like playing at that normal level, that normal playing field that everyone else gets, almost got to him a bit, you know? I'm glad that he did take the time off to kind of go back down to the challenger level and prove himself. But I think mentally he was still in that mindset where he believed he belonged. And when the USTA wasn't granting him that stuff anymore, it was a bit of an issue. So yeah, I don't think it was that big of an issue for him, but it kind of told us the kind of personality Donald was to have for the future. And personally, that's why I actually love him so much, just because he's such an outspoken character, for better or worse. He's almost like a Kyrgios figure, maybe a Kyrgios light figure, where he's always saying something interesting, I suppose. But I don't know. He seemed to have a good year that year, so maybe he needed to get fired up in general.
Again, we bang the drum on this podcast all the time for some more damn personality on this tour, and we wish sometimes the ATP would just let them speak out a little bit. Let's touch on 2011 then. So, beats Andy Murray at Indian Wells, which is a huge win for him, wins a challenger event, makes a deep run of the semifinal, Washington, D.C. It's a good year for him. It's the best year on tour. He makes it into the top 40 in the world before we come on to the US Open. Do you think there was a defining feature of why he managed to why this was the pinnacle of his career in terms of the first half of 2011? Was perhaps this a conditioning thing or a mentality thing or just a dedication thing in general? Why do you think this was such a good year for him?
I think it's a little bit of all of that, Simon. You know, as you mentioned, I think Donald at this point still hadn't found where maybe he was supposed to be in the rankings, but he definitely aspired to be really good. And I think the previous years of good minor league wins kind of really pushed his mentality and his attitude towards the game really high, where he really wanted to make a mark as he was coming into his early to mid 20s, and just a solid run of consistent wins really boosted him up. And as he got to the US Open, you know, almost his home soil in a sense, it was the crowd, it was the opponents he was playing, how well he was playing. It really just kind of pushed his game to another level that maybe we hadn't seen before then. And he just played absolutely fantastic throughout the entire tournament. He made it to the fourth round. One of the most defining features of that tournament was him beating Stanislas Wawrinka.
So his match against Stan, it's hard to find, it is very hard to find highlights, and it's very hard to find the match in general from that US Open. For some bizarre reason, the US Open seems to have under lock and key any single highlights from Donald Young, which is very, very amusing in its own right. But the things that I did see in that match, when the little things that are available to it, you can see how he would be successful against a player like Stanislav Wawrinka, someone who is teeing off on every single ball, someone who is trying to hit a winner on basically every single stroke, and someone who really is going to miss for going for too much. And the same could not be said for when he's playing his opponent in Donald Young. And I think this is a really good example of seeing Young in a nutshell, which is he's playing against a player who clearly is going for more than he is and has bigger weapons than he does. But he stands around, he hangs around, and he makes Wawrinka work for every single point that he gets. And I think that's really a good summary of where he's at this point. And it was going to take a 5-set grinding win against a lot of these players who have bigger weapons than him. But I think it's a really good summarization of his career in a nutshell at this point. I don't know whether you would agree with that.
No, I do agree, Simon. I was actually at that match myself. I'm from New York, so I was a Donald Young fan at the time, so I was at the match. Unfortunately, I left right before the 5th set to go watch James Blake for whatever reason. But yeah, he was so scrappy. He was just seriously getting everything back. The crowd was fully behind him. It almost seems like Donald Young is the kind of person who thrives under that underdog pressure. He loves the crowd support. It almost like the noise level, as the noise level was raised, his own game was raised. He was getting everything nice and deep. He was really running everything down. He was clearly getting in the mind of Stan. And, this is not the Stan we saw a few years later who would win the Roland Garros, but he was still quite the formidable opponent. And, it really, like I said, it changed Donald. He almost had a new appreciation for the game, and he would go on a tear that tournament. He was really playing fantastic. And that underdog mentality, it almost seemed like when he joined the tour as this hot thing, he crumbled under that pressure, started from the bottom, made his way up to this point, and now he's the underdog again, and he's succeeding. So it's almost like this balance of power as to what the crowd expectation is of him versus what he believes of himself. It almost has to balance out perfectly to get this level of Donald Young that we've never seen before. So it's interesting to see going forward in his career, especially.
So he eventually bows out to Andy Murray in the 4th round. He follows that up with his first ATP final at the Thailand Open, where he's annihilated by Andy Murray in the final. He gets bageled. It's 0-2 in the final, which is, many players, many better players have been bageled by Andy Murray as well. So no shame in that. And also it's a good indication of where his level is at, which is that he still made it to a final. He made it to a tour final, which is an incredible achievement. He ends the year ranked 39 in the world. Big year for him in 2011. Lots are expected of him. And I don't really think anyone could have expected what he sort of followed up in 2012 with. And it's now this infamous 17-match losing streak. Is this the case that he sort of believed his own hype a little bit? Or is this just the case that he was now hunted? He was in a position where he was 39 in the world. He was getting better draws. He was playing against better players. And he just sort of crumbled as a result of that. So I wonder whether was it more a him thing in terms of his preparation, his mental sort of attitude towards the game? Or is it more just the fact that he played against players who just wanted to beat him really badly?
I have no doubt in my mind that Donald definitely thought he belonged there. He definitely earned that ranking by every measure. And that being said, at 39 ranked in the world, he's now granted direct access to some of the biggest tournaments in the world, whether it be Grand Slams or Masters events. And he no longer had to play the Challenger titles to build him up. And he no longer had those Challenger level wins to help boost his confidence. So going into the year, he started off maybe the first couple months shaky. And then as soon as he was playing consistent Masters 1000 after Masters 1000, it was just going really downhill really fast. Again, he didn't have any sort of wins to help cushion him, build his confidence. When you're getting smoked by a top 20 player every other week, believe me, it would break on me too. It's hard to say. Did Donald, belong at 39 in the world? Were his skills there? Maybe not. It's really hard to say. He definitely had the talent. I had no doubt that, and despite the circumstances, he had the ability to beat those players, but I don't think he was in the right place at the right time, and it showed when almost comically, he would just lost every single match he played for, I think, six months or so, and dubbed almost one of the worst losing streaks in the history of tennis ever, behind another jokester, Vince Spadea, who is another character for another video. But yeah, it was a weird year for Donald. And again, I love Donald, so I would go to different tournaments to watch him, and it was just, you could tell as the summer went on, the attitude was just going lower and lower. He was smashing rackets. His mom, going back to his parents, he travels with just his mom, I believe, and maybe his brother, his family, and he doesn't have a coaching staff on him. It's just his parents, and he goes back to the hotel and speaks with his family. It's very uncommon, for sure, in the professional tennis scene to have this family backing you throughout your entire career. And it's hard to say whether he had the right staff on him to keep his brain in check a bit. And as the summer went on, it was almost unbelievable what was going on. Eventually, he snapped it, but Simon, I think at that point the damage was done. He was kind of broken mentally for a bit.
And I think you raised the really interesting point here, which is whether or not he could have benefited from a different voice in the ear, whether or not he could have benefited from just a different coaching voice, perhaps someone who can give him some different advice, maybe take on a former player into the camp, someone who's been there before, just to give a bit of guidance to this young kid, because he's still really young here. That's the thing that we forget, and we always tend to forget about these things, that these players are trying to figure this stuff out at 21, 22, 23, 24. That's still incredibly young for a player still making it, to be making millions of dollars and being sent to these tournaments without really much guidance. It's impossible to say that he probably should have done that, but you can understand, given how close he is to his family and what he's known in the tennis world. But I think we'd be lying if we said we didn't think that he should have probably brought a different voice into the camp at that point.
Yeah, it's really up to opinion. Of course, I think his family has the best intentions in his mind. He definitely had the best intentions in his mind. And it's not like he was a terrible player by any means. He definitely had the skill. It was almost like just a mental blockage that he just could not get over that hump. Maybe at least one other person to come in and kind of take his mind off things, maybe a guidance counselor in some aspect. It was just a very strange time for Donald Young. And, you brought up a great point that he was so young. Already in this podcast, we've chronicled the rise, the fall, the rise, and now the fall again of Donald Young in what, 5 years or so? It's a pretty wild roller coaster for him at this point. And, if he was in his mid-30s at this point, maybe he'd either call it a career or just be used to it. But, I'm already older now at 24 years old than he has been throughout this entire process. And I can only imagine the kind of mental strain it puts on you, especially when, all the expectations, especially coming from your coaching box, your mom is right there. So very strange time. And as we'll see, he recovers a bit going forward. But it's really interesting to kind of look at.
I think he deserves a huge amount of credit, honestly, to come back from that 17-match losing streak, to come back from all the pressure and everything that's placed on him, to have the rest of his career that he does. And I know it sounds like I'm being sort of a glib about it, that he manages to eke out a career where he is ranked between 50 and 100 in the world and is doing well at challenger level events. But that takes a hell of a lot of guts, honestly, to come back from the year that he had, effectively that people were laughing at him. You see some of the coverage that ESPN, some of the big sporting outlets are talking about. Just, it's never fun to see your name in association with longest losing streaks of all time. So I think if I was going to summarize sort of the rest of his career following 2011 and that 17-match losing streak, it's a lot of guts, honestly. And I think that probably gets forgotten about him in association with his career.
No, I agree. He really does take so much almost verbal abuse in the press and on the forums and whatnot. I hope for his sake he doesn't take a look at much of it himself, but is also a strange time just for U.S. tennis because, again, we're at, what point, 2012 at this point, we still really haven't seen that American star come forward. So if anything, that unjust pressure still is on Donald Young a bit to kind of, finally, like, come on, like we're waiting a bit, we have Ryan Harrison and Sam Querrey and John Isner a bit, but these are all again, maybe top 50 players at this point, barely. So America, is waiting for their next player, and Donald Young is not giving them what they want, and that insane pressure for that young kid. It's tough, but you know what? Like I said, he recovers a little bit, and he starts going back to the challenger levels again. I think he went from something like 30 something in the world. I don't have it in front of me, down to the hundreds, to the 200s almost. And again, just like his teenage years, he builds himself back up.
He does indeed, and I think it's one of those things that I had completely forgotten from my mind that he made a semi-final at the French Open in 2017 in doubles. I just completely and utterly forgot that. And when doing the research for this episode and watching your video, it's one of those things that I think if anyone who is even inside of the tennis circuit asked you whether Donald Young made a semi-final of a Grand Slam, either singles or doubles, their automatic response would be, no, absolutely, that did not happen. But it did. I think that's testimony again. Yeah. I mentioned the word guts, right? I mean, that's just the reality of it. To come back from that and still make a semi-final at a Grand Slam, that's pretty astonishing.
Right. I'd love to see that trivia question posed to some of the big tennis brains and ask who made the semifinals of the 2017 French Open. I don't think Donald Young would be on the cusp of anyone's radar. But again, yeah, he's it's almost like when he's the underdog, when no one's thinking about him, he's almost like he's making his way back up with anyone even realizing. And I just think that pressure taken off of him is what he needs. We keep kind of going back to his childhood, those expectations, and it's really tough for someone, to constantly be in the spotlight, to face those expectations, to go into a match saying, I know I have to win. I think when he's almost unburdened, again, he's looser. You can see it almost when he plays. He's really hitting out through his shots. He's less nervous. His verbal abuse to himself is a bit less, because having, again, watched him in person, he's definitely quite not the most positive person on the court. He's definitely a super nice guy, as you can tell, but he definitely gives himself quite a bit of flack, for sure, on court, and I don't think his mom is necessarily happy about that. But yeah, it's that's Donald Young for you.
So where should we net out with Donald Young? What do you think his career sort of tells us in general? You said rise and fall and up and down. He has like 10 different arcs to his career. He's a fascinating kid growing up. He's a fascinating adult. Not just, I think race is a big factor here as well that we didn't touch up on a whole lot, which is that he had to endure a whole lot of, I'm sure, not particularly nice things that have happened throughout his career as well. It can't be easy being an African American player growing up in a sport that hasn't been particularly receptive to some of those players. And you see some of the treatment that the Williams sisters got when they were younger as well. But if you sort of had a top line takeaway from what Donald Young's career and maybe in respect to some of the junior players coming up now, I particularly look at someone like Coco Gauff. Do you think he's a cautionary tale, or do you think he's just he's just someone that you can look at, examine his entire career, and just sort of take away what you want from it, to be honest?
Right. It's, again, the headline for Donald Young's career would be out of proportion expectations. So much was demanded on him at such a young age, and he's still dealing with that even to this day in his I'm not sure if he's in his 30s at this point, but he probably he's close to it at least. At this point, he's again fallen, and he's in the 300s rankings. So he's definitely, I'm not sure if he'll be able to get back up. But then, yeah, like you said, you take a look at the rising star of Coco Gauff, and she's almost in a very similar situation in the fact that she's, in her teens, 14, 15, 16 years old, and, having made a deep run in Wimbledon and the US Open. You almost think, is she the next big person? And she's been now featured on ESPN and the front page of tennis.com and, all these interviews with international syndicated newspapers and magazines. Again, we're seeing this insane pressure from the media for this girl to succeed. And I mean, by all means, she's doing it somehow. It's amazing. And you almost think, well, if she could have done it, then what was wrong with Donald Young? But again, there's so many different factors, kind of what went on to her as opposed to Donald Young. Without going into the story of too much of Coco Gauff, I think right now the way she's being treated by the USTA and everyone else, I think they're doing it right. I think they've learned from their mistake with Donald Young as what not to do. for a kid that age and kind of ease off a little bit and let them succeed on their own merits. And by gosh, Coco Gauff is doing it. And unfortunately, Donald Young being one of the first of his generation to do something like that, without going back to, the 80s and 70s and whatnot, he's really a cautionary tale to look at. So whether it's his own inability to win, or was it, issues and mistakes made in his childhood that maybe burned him out from such a young age, it's hard to say, but you know what? There's nothing more fun than going to a Donald Young match and seeing some of the antics pulled. And honestly, without everything else being said, the pure talent that you see out of this kid, I don't even say kid anymore. He's an adult now, but pure talent seen out of this guy. So he's an interesting guy.
Andrew, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's been really fun to chat about Donald Young. Ups and downs, ups and downs, ups and downs. That's probably how I'd summarize his career. What have you got coming up? Where can people find you? And what is the next mini documentary / YouTube video I'm going to be seeing out of you?
Absolutely. Well, yeah. So, again, my channel's definitely almost in its infancy, only a handful, a few 100 subscribers at this point. But, I put my full-time job is a director of tennis, and I work 40, 50 hours a week on court and programming and whatnot. But in the little bit of off time I get, I do spend a few hours editing my videos every night. And it's been such a fun time. I just love doing it. And in case anyone listening has not checked it out, which I would assume most of you have not, it's mainly just a channel of me documenting some of the most interesting stories in tennis. And I'm a really big music person, so I almost create an atmospheric sense to my videos where it almost plays out like a little movie, mini documentary, as Simon so graciously put it. But yeah, the next video is going to be detailing the absolute disaster of the Adria Tour that was only a few months ago. So a bit more of a modern take on things, and to kind of see, again, some of the issues that plague the wonderful sport of tennis, and some lessons and morals we can learn from some of the most ridiculous issues that go on. But yeah, check me out in the future. I hope to have a lot more content planned, and hope to see you all there. I appreciate you having me on, Simon.
Thanks, Andrew. Go and subscribe to Colt Tennis on YouTube. Thanks, Andrew. We'll talk to you, I'm sure, again.
Have a good one, Simon. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much to Andrew for coming on the show, and thank you, as always, for listening. You can find Devang on Twitter at DesaiDevang, and you can find the show at Open Era Pod. If you like what we're doing, then please consider giving us a rating or review on your chosen platform. It always goes a long, long way with helping us. And if you really like the show, then please think about joining the Patreon at Open Era. You get the show ad-free, and you get access to the best damn Discord in the world. We will talk to you soon.